Hello everyone, welcome to another fun and exciting learning encounter as we're going to unlock the beauties and mysteries here in literature. And this is true understanding what literary criticism is about. So literary criticism is an approach for us to better understand the writings that these authors made. So it is a bridge for us to understand and unlock meanings in every writing. It is not about fault finding, but rather revealing the truth and giving readers an option to better understand these writings. And this will be made possible by understanding what are these approaches? So we will focus on new criticism and mini-critic. But before that, I want you to grab your notebook and pen because we're going to have an initial assessment called schema test. I have provided 5 simple questions for you to answer, and I'm going to stream it in your Google Classroom. There will be a submission for you to post the link of your answers. So let us begin. Schema test. Directions. Answer the questions below and choose the answer from the choices given. Write your answer in our notebook. So number 1. It is a literary movement that started in the last 1920s and 1930s, which originated through traditional criticism that is marked by concentration on the language, imagery, and emotional or intellectual tensions in literary works. Is it A. Formalism, B. Traditional criticism, C. New criticism, and D. Mini-Critic? Number 2. This is a form of criticism based largely on the works of Carl Jung, with individual plot patterns of literature with sophisticated and realistic works. A. Myth criticism, B. Psychoanalytic criticism, C. Post-colonialism, and D. Surrealism. I know you are ready with the third question. Andre Breton is the major figure in this theory that challenged the societal norms to shock the sensibilities of theologians. Is it A. Structuralism, B. Surrealism, C. Linguistic criticism, and letter D. Existentialism? Fourth question. It is a way of thinking about the words which is predominantly concerned with the perceptions and description of structures. A. Linguistic criticism, B. Structuralism, C. Surrealism, D. Existentialism. Last but not the least, we have the fifth question. This is a relation to structuralism and work against seeing language as a stable closed system. A. Deconstructionism, B. Structuralism, C. Constructivism, and D. Literary criticism. Alright, so with the 5 questions, I'm very sure if you stay tuned with this presentation, we're going to identify each, and I am going to give you another test like this one for us to compare how far did you understand our lesson after this one. So, are you ready to learn? I hope so. Today, what specific topics are you going to learn from me? These are the new criticism, myth criticism or the archetypal, surrealism, structuralism, and deconstructionism. Words for now might be hard on the first glance, but as we go along with our discussion, it will be just a piece of cake. So I hope you bear with me and be open with our discussion for today. So let's have it one by one. What is this new criticism? or formalism? How come that it is considered as new? So let's get to know. New criticism is also known as formalism. On the first place, it is termed as an objective approach to literary criticism. How come that this is objective and not subjective? So let me just give you a little background of what this new criticism is about. So new criticism emerged on post-World War I of Anglo-American literary critical theory that insisted on the intrinsic value of a work and focused attention on the individual work alone as an independent unit of meaning. It was opposed to the critical practice of bringing historical or biographical data to bear on the interpretation of work. What made it really distinct is that this new criticism focuses on the text itself. It disregards the other notions before, the other approaches before, of assessing a specific literary text by connecting it to the author's biographical context, to the period when this literary text existed, meaning the time. At the same idea, aside from the author's background, the historical context, and the symbolism that is in the literature, in the text itself. So new criticism arose in opposition to biographical or vaguely impressionistic approaches. The new critics treat a work of literature as if it were a self-contained and self-referential object. So the focus here of this new criticism is the text itself. No other external factors will be assessed, just like as what I've said, the author's intention, the life of the author, the time of it existed, the social, cultural, and political background during that time. So, new critics think that the text itself should be the sole source of interpretation. That's why it is called objective way of analyzing a text. The primary technique employed in new critical approach is close analytic reading of the text. Remember that, class. It's close analytical reading of the text. A technique as old as Aristotle's Poetics. The new critics, however, introduced refinement into method. So, as it revolves with the other existing approaches, it is more on refinement to the existing method. Okay? So what is the focus of this new criticism or formalism? Again, the new critics perform a close reading. It concentrates on relationship within the text. So let me use my pen here. Concentrating on relationship within the text that gives its own distinctive character or form. All information that is essential to the information and interpretation of a work must be found within the text itself. So it is text-centered approach. There is no need to bring in outside information about the author's life. So we will disregard that thing. Because in the biographical context or approach in literature, we always find the relationship on the past experiences of the author, relating it to the instances on his writing as a reflection, because we believe that what the authors have experienced has something to do and as a reflection in their writing. But in here, we will disregard that. The work itself, the text itself, is the sole authority in interpreting or in giving interpretation to this writing or to this approach. So they are not interested on literary it focuses, on the literary devices, and they are not interested in the works that affect on the readers. So they are not interested on the works or on the life of the author. So the focus here is to spend much time analyzing the irony, imagery, paradox, and metaphors of the literary works. So we will focus here on the different figures of speech. So we will focus on irony, imagery, paradox, and metaphors present in that literary text. It is interested in setting, symbols, characters, and point of view incorporated in the piece. That's why it is called formalism. It is more on the elements that is present in that specific text. A formalist basically would focus on literary devices, as what I have said, of a piece of writing, especially irony. So that's it for new criticism or formalism. It is a revolt against the previous literary approaches in a way that we see the text itself as a sole authority in the interpretation, that we focus primarily on the imagery, irony, paradox, and metaphors, and the different symbols, characters, and setting present in it. The text itself will be our main focus here. We disregard the author's background, the different past events that happened during that time, the different cultural beliefs and practices, as well as the political viewpoints during that time. The time itself is being disregarded. So please focus on the next one. We have the myth criticism or archetypal. So what is this myth criticism or archetypal? Let's first define what is archetype. So archetype came from the Greek word arche, which means beginning, and typos, imprint. Archetype, these are the symbols which are recurring or always present in the different literary texts. It could be the theme or the motive in literature, a pattern from which other and similar things can develop. Archetypes often appear in various cultural traditions and myths. And with this archetype, we find it somehow related to the experiences of us people, us human. So assessing those recurring patterns, recurring symbols, motifs in literature, with the use of this technique, with the use of this approach, we will relate its meaning to our everyday living. Okay, so that is an archetype. So what is this topic about? I want you to focus your attention here in this image. So what is this? This is a manticore. So manticore is a mythological creature that was said to be unconquerable. So unlike formalism or new criticism, it is more on assessing the text itself, it's more on the language, it's more on the different imagery, patterns in it. In mythological archetypal, we insert here different mythological creature or somehow related to myth and legend. So Manticore is a Persian legendary creature similar to Egyptian Sphinx that proliferated in the Western European medieval art as well. So archetypal criticism assumes that there is a collection of symbols, images, characters, and motifs that suggest basically the same response in all people. This is what I'm telling you before. So the archetypal patterns will help clarify the individual text by connecting it to more universal patterns that often transcend or go beyond to literature itself. So it's about finding connection, finding meaning of these recording patterns or archetypes to us people, okay, to the different things that we experience. Somehow, this could be related to us, okay? So these are the archetypes as source of literary powers. These are the things that we have to consider in understanding literature. So whenever we see these archetypes, it's easy for us to give interpretation because these are the recurring patterns which might be visible in the literary text. We have archetypal women, the good mother, the terrible mother, and the soulmate, such as the Virgin Mary. So this could be in a feministic approach also, that we use women. So somehow, there's always a character as women that we view them as a good mother, a terrible one, or a soulmate. The use of patterns like water, symbols like water, it could be uh, having a meaning of creation, birth, death, resurrection, purification, redemption, fertility, growth. How about for garden? We see this as paradise, as in Eden, the innocence and fertility. Desert, spiritual emptiness, death and hopelessness. Red color, we associate with blood, sacrifice, passion, and disorder. How about for green? Growth and fertility. Same with garden. Black, chaos, death, and evil. Serpent, evil, sensuality, mystery, wisdom, destruction. Seven is perfection. Persona, it means social personality, usually the hero or animal, or a soul image, usually a heroine, animal I mean. So we have hero archetype. The hero is involved in a quest in which he overcomes obstacles. He experiences initiations involving a separation, transformation, and return. Okay? So those are the different archetypes. Again, these archetypes are recurring patterns that could be seen in different texts as you read it. And with its interpretation, we have these different meanings as to different archetypes. Okay, so that is archetypal or mythical criticism. Let's have this one. The third one is surrealism. So what is this surrealism? So surrealism is based on the belief in the superior reality of dream, according to Andre Breton, a famous poet during that time. Surrealism means super real or beyond reality. Okay? So surrealism in literature can be defined as an artistic attempt to bridge together reality and the imagination. So finding a relationship also to what is existed and what is not, what is real from what is not. Surrealists seek to overcome contradictions of the conscious and unconscious minds by creating unreal or bizarre stories full of juxtapositions. So juxtapositions occurs when two things are placed side by side for comparison, often to highlight the contrast between the elements. The simplest example would be the yin-yang symbol. Therefore, you have a circle where the black and white elements stand in contrast to one another. Okay? So, we have here another picture. Before we have the manticore, now we have this one. I know you are very familiar to this. So in Lewis Carroll's classic tale, Alice journeys to Wonderland, where straight streams across the land and living fences separate the space between into equal squares. So in my opinion, Wonderland strikingly resembles a chessboard, said Alice. So this whole world is chess. This one is a huge match. So surrealism, again, is about finding reality to imagination, but it is more creative, it is more imaginative and often fictionated. So surrealism sought to free people's spirituality and psychologically. These artists and writers wanted to repair the damage done by World War One, wherein during this World War One, everybody felt devastated, everyone was depressed, and therefore for them to transcend from what had happened on that specific event, they find a way to have something, to regain something, and this is through surrealism. Unfortunately, World War II was on the brink, and such movement made the surrealists a target. So, medyo nag-stop dyan. Okay, so these are the characteristics in literature when we talk about surrealism. So surrealist literature will have contrasting images or ideas. This technique is used to help readers make new connections and expand the reader's reality, rather than the reader's idea of what reality is. Surrealism will use images and metaphors to compel the reader to think deeper and reveal subconscious meaning. Instead of relying on plot, surrealist writers instead focus on the characters, discovery, and imagery to force readers to dig into their unconscious and style what they find. What else? Surrealism also uses poetic styles to create dreamlike and fantastic stories that often defy logic. That's one. Rather than incorporate the normal prosaic structure like linear plots and structured setting, surrealism uses poetic techniques like leaps in thinking, this is pre-association, abstract ideas, and nonlinear timeline. So I might say that with the use of surrealism as an approach to literature, we go beyond what is normal, what is expected, that there must be just a start and end, a linear way of plot, position, rising, climax, denouement, and end. In this one, it is somehow complex, dreamlike, and fantastic stories are the highlight, and often they defy logic, abstract ideas, something like that. So let's have number 4, structuralism. For structuralism, language as a stable, closed system. So remember that. The focus here is on the structure, the form. Okay? So this is based primarily on the linguistic theories of Ferdinand de Saussure. Structuralism considered language as a system of signs and signification, the elements of which are understandable only in relation to each other and to the system. So, structuralism as a philosophical stance. Structuralists are interested in the interrelationship between units, also called the surface phenomena, what is present there, and rules, the ways the units can be put together, the interpretation. So let's have structuralism as a philosophical stance. Structuralists are interested in the relationship of these two, as what I have said. So in language, units are words, and the rules which are forms of grammar which order the words. So let's have this example. So the units are the following. We have the princess, stepmother, and prince. The rules, how we put this unit, as we interpret it, could be this one. A princess is persecuted by a stepmother and rescued and married by a prince. So we can see that the stepmother is evil, the princess here is the victim, the prince and princess have to marry. So this is the structure as it goes in the story. Okay. So that's it. How about Deconstructionism? So Deconstructionism was both created and has been profoundly influenced by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida. Okay. What do we need to deconstruct? So if we build something, there is always a purpose. Why do we need to break it? So imagine or try to look on the significance of this picture. This is not just a scaffold needed for a building, but we see the whole, and the holes of scaffolding. Why is that so? So let's identify it. Okay. So have you ever seen the scaffolding that goes up during the construction of a building? The frame shows what the building will look like, but that's not the only part. Shift your focus a little and you'll see the spaces between the frame bones, and that is the holes. It's the whole of the metal itself and the holes in between that make up the future building shape. Similarly, deconstruction looks at what makes the text whole and what holes are in between its pieces. In other words, what's said and what's left unsaid. Okay? So we see a bigger picture and that's the whole. And when we look into the different elements, the bits and pieces of it that makes up the whole, those are the holes that in the Constructionism, we see these holes as very important features in coming up with a great interpretation. So we must never neglect those. So deconstructionism, just like formalism or new criticism, involves the close reading of texts in order to demonstrate any given text as irreconcilably contradictory meanings rather than being unified or logical whole. As J. Hillis Miller said, deconstructionism is not a dismantling of the structure of a text, but a demonstration that it has already dismantled itself. Okay? It's apparently solid ground, is no rock but a thin air. Okay, let's see why. So the focus are the following. Through a deconstructive reading, it can reveal the incompatible possibilities generated by the text. It is impossible for the reader to settle on any permanent meanings. So class, in deconstructionism, we always think that these readers might be having different interpretation and we must not settle on permanent meanings. Somehow, or perhaps, the character might change, the instances might change, and it is not always linear. Okay? For some instance, let's say the character is bad, we should never expect that in the end of the story, the character is always, or will end always, as a bad one, or a tragic one. There might be shifting, okay? And that specific thing is being subjected to deconstructionism. So they reject the formalist view that the work of literature is demonstrably unified from the beginning to the end. As a result, deconstructionists see text as more radically heterogeneous than do formalists. Okay? So I have a research here about the theory of deconstructionism. This will be discussed by Jennifer Hedgecock. She's a very profound expert in the field of this theory. So let's watch this YouTube video.
I want to go back to the theme, so far for the TED Talk, in that it is to construct, to deconstruct, to rebuild. And so when you look at the order in which that appears, it seems to be very logical. But really, there is also something suspiciously irrational about the way that it appears. So to be more specific, why would we construct something only to deconstruct it later on, to take it apart? What is the purpose in building it? And so I go back to 1966, and on October 21st, the famous French philosopher Jacques Derrida had given a speech there, a lecture there. And in the audience at Johns Hopkins University, there are very famous professors, philosophers there who were also present. And this included Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault, and of course, Paul de Man. And so they're listening to him speak, and he is making this shocking declaration. And it goes back to that point that has been discussed so far. And what he says is that there is absolutely no meaning. Language has no meaning.
Language has no meaning.
That a structure has no meaning to it. So what he's addressing and going back to is to the late 19th century philosopher Ferdinand Saussure, who's another French philosopher. but his point was on structuralism. And his argument is that, well, you have to have a structure, that only a structure that we produce is something that also produces meaning. And Derrida, this many years later, is arguing that no, it doesn't. And again, this becomes very shocking because if you don't have any meaning, then what really is a purpose to life? And it gets into now what specifically is deconstruction? What exactly does that mean? And he is arguing that the way in which you find meaning is that you have to tear something apart. You have to take it apart. You have to break it apart in order to discover and understand what that meaning is. So I go to the use of language, that words mean something to us. They can have an emotional impact on us, depending upon what that word is, but also it relies quite a bit on what our experience is and how we attach our experience to the signification of that particular word. But what Derrida is arguing is this, is that language is not fixed. There is no finality to a particular word. What Saussure had argued was this, is that a word is a unit. And when we string words together to form a sentence, that it constructs rules. So again, we have a certain rule that is constructed by language, by words themselves. But now let's look at it this way and try to understand exactly what Derrida was arguing here. So I can take a word like peace, and what Derrida claims is that that word it doesn't have one signified meaning. It has several signified meanings that can continue on for an eternity. So again, the dictionary definition of the word peace is freedom from a disturbance. Okay, fine. But now you take the word freedom, well, what exactly does freedom mean? And freedom means the power and the right to express my own idea, to take action, to think independently. Okay? So now what does the word power mean? Power means the ability to influence others or to influence behavior. All right? Now we go on to influence. Well, what does influence mean? Influence means the development of a certain behavior, the effect of a behavior, to have an effect on one's behavior. What does effect mean? It means change as a result of a cause. It can go on forever. So again, we go back to that question. So how is it that understanding how language can be signified and has a string of signifiers, how does that lead to deconstruction? How is it that I can actually understand meaning by taking something apart? And so I want to reference the book by Toni Morrison, Sula. And the book starts around right after World War I. And you have the leading character, Shadrach, and the opening scene is him coming back from Europe, and he is completely shell-shocked. And the home to which he returns is Medallion, Ohio, which is a small town in the Midwest. And it is a community of African Americans, and they live in a section of Medallion that is called the Bottom. But the bottom really isn't at the bottom, of that area. It's actually on a hilltop. But that hilltop is very arid. There's not a lot of growth around that particular part. But it's called the Bottom. And once again, we go back to what do words mean? What does language mean? And when Shadrach comes back, he is shell-shocked. In his way, his method of dealing with this and trying to assimilate back into his community is by having what is called National Suicide Day. And what he does is he comes out with a sign one day a year, and he asks anyone who wants to commit suicide to come follow him along. And this really unrattles that community, the first time that it happens. But then as time goes on, as years progress, it becomes kind of almost like a convention within their culture. That again, they arrange if they're trying to plan out something that week, well, it's close to National Suicide Day, so I know we have to take care of it in advance. It becomes kind of part of their institution. In other words, the actual meaning of suicide in that particular community, it would be beneath them, that they are not victims. And so, and that is a signifier of suicide, but they turn that word around. And the way in which that word is used within that community is they are rebelling against convention. They are rebelling against the signified meaning of suicide. As the story progresses, it really focuses on two young girls, Nell and Sula, and they are best friends from the time that they meet as small children. And then a tragic event happens where Sula, who comes from a very kind of unconventional way of life, her mother is unmarried, she grows up with her grandmother. Her grandmother actually had her leg cut off by a train so she could collect the insurance money to help support her family. Whereas Nell comes from a home in which it is the epitome of convention. Two parents that have been together for a long time. They have a normal family life in terms of, again, the emphasis on school and education. And it appears on the surface that everything is exactly as it should be, according to the nuclear family. But that is not how Sula lives. These two girls who come from very different backgrounds, they become best friends. And on one of those afternoons when they're coming home from school, Sula picks up a small child and starts swinging him around as a way of playing with them. And they are near a river, and Sula unfortunately lets the child slip out of her hands, and the child ends up in a river and drowns. And they basically, the two girls stand there and they watch him drown. They are paralyzed. They don't know what to do. They forget the event and they leave the scene, and after that, their relationship is never the same. So eventually, when they become young women, it is Nell who settles down and gets married and has children and stays in Medallion, Ohio. But at the age of 18, it is Sula who takes off and leaves, and she goes to the big city, and she has this other life that she creates. And 10 years later, all of a sudden, there she is. She shows up back in Medallion, and she is dressed to the hilt, and there is a lot of suspicion that revolves around her because she doesn't look like a 30-year-old. She looks like she's still young. And she's not married, and she doesn't have any children. And here she is coming back. And of course, all the townspeople are very alert and aware of what she was like when she was a child. That when she was bullied, she did not react in fear. She reacted by taking her finger and cutting it off and telling her bullies that if you think I can do this to myself, just think what I can do to you. But it's always a reaction of fear. And so when she comes back to Medallion, she moves in with her grandmother, Eva, and Eva is questioning her, how come you're not married? How come you don't have any children? How come you never had babies? And Sula's response is this. She says, I don't want to make other people, I want to make myself. And again, by this time it's 1937, very different culturally and socially compared to how we live now in the 21st century. When you think about the roles of men and women, women are not pursuing more independent lives at that point. So she and Nell are reunited, and they start spending time together. And as things turn out, Sula ends up having an affair with Nell's husband, Jude. And Jude leaves, and Jude never comes back. And Sula, by that point, has already had a bad reputation of taking other women's husbands and having affairs with them. But unlike her mother, who did the same thing, Sula does the cruelest thing of all. When she has an affair with them, she leaves them, and she never bothers with them again. And so we go to her name, Sula, and her last name is Peace. And when we look at her behavior and her actions, it is something that is defined as discord and chaos. We automatically, as a reader, assume that she is bringing chaos to other people's lives. Yes. But that's not, in fact, what happens. And again, it goes back to that question of language. How could a character that is regarded as being purely evil, bring about peace within that community? And it is because that when she rejects those husbands, they go back home to their wives, and their wives, instead of feeling disregarded and dismissed and cheated on, they start feeling compassion for their husbands, and they start taking care of them like they never did before. And the husbands end up becoming better fathers to their children. They don't drink. They get jobs. They make money. They participate within the house. What Sula does is she ironically establishes order within that community. Again, it is to take something apart and to understand internally how it actually works and how it operates And you can only understand that when you examine each component and you begin to carefully put it back together to rebuild. But Sula ends up making the biggest mistake that she could make. She violates her own code, and she ends up falling in love with someone.
Oh,
And he is the one who eventually leaves her.
oh,
And
that's so
she is
sad.
wise enough and experienced enough to realize that he's never coming back. And at that point, she gives up and she ends up dying.
Oh,
And it is
so
Nell who
sad.
comes and visits her before she departs this world. And even when we get to death, Morrison makes this really important and interesting claim, and it is that, death does not happen by accident. Life happens by accident, but death is something that is very deliberate.
Mhm.
And we see that with her. It becomes her choice. That one love affair and that one event becomes so powerfully moving and so emotional that she can't recover from it, neither emotionally or spiritually or physically. And she's gone. And so we look at, and I guess I want to close on this, and, thinking about a novel like that, and also thinking about, with all these different, social examples, that have been discussed. And perhaps, for a long time at the academic level, we will take those, very complex assumptions and we try to understand how they apply to the social order, how they apply to conventions. And sometimes they don't go very well examined. There's something that is left out.
Mhm.
And perhaps it is a process of deconstructing something. And in the use of that word, I want to use a different word in this case. It is to demystify it, to understand it, to demystify it. In other words, to identify the mystery, and therefore it no longer is mysterious, it is familiar to us.
Mhm.
And there is no way of being, familiar unless we're actually willing to explore. And so, and especially if we depend on convention too much, going back to the character Nell, Nell depends on those conventions because she honestly believes that's what's going to make her a good person.
Correct.
And what we see is that it leads to a very limited perspective,
Correct.
a very narrow view. And what we hear today is that we have to do away with those narrow perspectives, maybe be more conscientious about how we use language. And with that, if we look at ourselves, and that is, as a student, that maybe the purpose is more than just simply learning and becoming more advanced within a specialized field, but I think what it urges us to do is to try to live a more examined life. Thank you.
Okay, that was a very nice sharing coming from the expert in the theory deconstructionism. So, what I want you to remember in that presentation was that in order for us to make a new one, to rebuild something, we must break a specific thing, and that whole must be examined thoroughly because that's what makes it whole. It violates formalism linear idea that is all about Nell's life. As what she said, it's the convention. Nels think that it is what made her happy. But Suwan, Peace, lived a different life, okay? And could make possible things happen. So after having an affair with the different husbands in the community, it turned out to be positive one that these women should feel that they are being neglected, they are somehow disregarded, but on the other way around, this men realize something that they must be a man who really plays the role of being a father in the family. So deconstructionism somehow violates ideology of being too straight, too linear, and we see deconstructionism as something needed in order for us to build a new perspective. So that was a very nice discussion coming from her. I really like it. So I hope you learned something from our expert coming from TEDx. So I'd like to make a wrap up on the different topics that you should learn today because I think this is very essential. So let's begin with the new criticism or formalism. So what you have to remember in this approach to literature is that it is an objective approach to literary criticism in a way that we focus solely on the text itself. We see text as the main source in interpreting what the author is trying to say by looking into its elements, assessing the characters, the setting, the plot, at the same time focusing on the different figures of speech present in here, like imagery, irony, metaphors. So it violates or it disregards the theory of historical biographical context in a way that we don't see the relationship of the past life of the author as reflected in the text, also the history, the culture, the political viewpoints, and the context, the time itself where this literature existed. It is more on the text itself and look into it as a sole source of information. And for the myth criticism or archetypal, we associate symbols by means of recurring patterns. And these are all archetypes. Okay? And these archetypes could be related to our own lives. Okay? That whenever we see these archetypes as a source of literary power, we can easily identify and give meaning to a specific literary text. Okay? It's associating mythical creatures, associating different things in literature. About surrealism, in order for the people to have a paradigm shift of what had happened on the World War One, they think of something super real or beyond its imagination, and therefore they had this reflected in literature to bridge the reality and imagination. So it contradicts the conscious and unconscious minds by creating unreal or bizarre stories, purely fictionated. But still, there's just juxtapositions because there might be two contrasting things, but we can see it as a whole, just like the yin and yang, balance of life. There could be some good side of us and bad side of us, which make us a whole thing, and that is also in surrealism. Just like the perfect example for surrealism could be the Alice in Wonderland and the Wizard of Oz. Okay? Alright, and for structuralism, we see that in interpreting a specific literary text, we focus on the language as a stable closed system. And with that, we should consider units as a surface phenomena and rules on how we are able to interpret those units. Okay? Just like these things. So we have the units as princess, stepmother, and prince. And the rules there here is how we see the relationship of these three things as we go along with the story. And when we talk about deconstructionism, it is something that we need to see the wholes in order for us to build or to see the totality or the wholeness of a specific literary text. So I hope that you learned something from me today, and get ready for the examination. Okay? So these are the new trends, new criticism, or the mini critics. And with that, I want to say thank you so much, and have a great day, everyone. Goodbye. Thank you.